Have you ever wanted to understand the biomechanics and technique of the WTA versus the ATP forehand? Well, let's get into it. I've put together some great clips here of pros, professional women, and you can see the evolution of the WTA forehand. I want to dive in and show you all the technique and biomechanics and the key points that I see. So let's look at Kasatkina here. Kasatkina is just a great example of ATP-style forehand for a female player. And you can see right off the bat here how nice her forehand looks. And we'll get into her forehand a little bit later. Let's talk about, evolution. Look at Sloane Stephens here. And look at the size of this backswing. And this is what I'm talking about in terms of like the traditional WTA forehand. Big, giant bubble loop here. Look at the way that racket loops around the body. Check this out. She's got a full Western grip. Look at this bent arm structure here. Look how far back the wrist is cocked here. I don't know if you can see that. Back in this area. That racket is way, way, way past the mid plane. If you look, like, imagine 6 p.m. And the racket's probably closer to parallel to the baseline. This is like a gigantic loop. And this is what for me, I'd like to avoid. Especially kids, I work with a lot of prodigies or adults. You want to try to avoid this giant loop. I'll play it for you again here. You can see how big this swing is. The racket comes up and over the head. See how the racket's looping up and over the head? Forget the grip. Don't worry too much about the grip. We'll look at Jen Brady in a minute here. But look at this. Look at where that racket is in relationship to the head. This is nuts. And Sloane's able to win. She won a Grand Slam with this forehand. She can hit it amazing. But it's not optimal in terms of the biomechanics. And we know that the men don't do it like this. Very few men have this size of loop. In fact, I can't think of one right now in the top 100. So we know that there's a better way to swing, even though she's a great player and she's got a great forehand. In my mind, this type of swing should have been adjusted when she was younger. Someone should have worked on the discipline of the backswing here. Here we go again. Look at the size of this. Look at the shape of that loop. So another thing I like to point out is, when you're looking at the ATP versus the WTA biomechanics, you look at the size of the backswing. Where's the racket going behind the back? Is it crossing the mid plane or not? And then you look at the hitting structure at impact. You also look to see if there's lag. You can see that Sloane has really good lag here. Pretty amazing lag, actually. And you can see how much this racket here, pretty incredible lag there. You can see how the angle of that racket in relationship to the wrist, it's just crazy. Just a huge angle here. You got the wrist, the racket's going that way, the forearm's there. Incredible lag. So that's one thing you're looking at. You're looking for lag. Then you're looking for the hitting arm structure. Look how she's pretty bent. Look at her elbow. This is like maybe 90 degrees. Looks to me about something like that in the arm structure. We'll look at Madison Keys next, and she's going to be similar. So typically with the WTA, you see this type of arm structure, 80 degrees, 90 degrees. maybe even more cramped. We've done videos on this channel of Swiatek, of Iga Swiatek, who is probably even more cramped than this at impact. A lot of the female players are cramped like this, so this creates a shorter lever, and we know from physics that is not optimal for the transfer of power. You can get more angular momentum. You can get more racket speed at the tip of the racket if you have a longer lever here, assuming that you can accelerate the lever the same as you would with this shorter lever. So the women oftentimes shorten the lever here, but they can still get a lot of power. So how's she getting more power? She's using this longer wind up. So she's getting this big trunk rotation, this big, a lot of, there's a number of factors in terms of power that I think people don't realize. This multifactorial. You have, one of the big ones here is horizontal shoulder adduction, adduction. So she goes way back here, and the shoulder is, she's building a lot of momentum using horizontal shoulder adduction, where the shoulder's coming around, the shoulder's coming around here. That's the adduction aspect, horizontally. She's getting a lot of power from ESR to ISR, external shoulder rotation to internal shoulder rotation. That's a big factor in the power. A lot of that ISR happens when she's back here. She's stretching out her shoulder. Her shoulder's getting to the point of max external rotation. So you got to think about the different joints. You really have to understand the anatomy and the physiology. So there's horizontal shoulder adduction happening here. There's external shoulder rotation to internal shoulder rotation. That's a big factor. There's there's like centrifugal force here, where the racket's coming around. So you have rotational physics that's happening here, where the racket head, the mass of the racket head, is being flung around rotationally around the center of the body, using the hips and the core musculature. You have the obliques are rotating, the paraspinals are rotating. So you have the abdominals contributing here in terms of rotation. You have the hips contributing here in terms of rotation. You have all of the GRFs starting from everything's coming up off of a good leg drive, and that entire kinetic chain is transferring up. The power is transferring up into the upper body, into the arm, in through the core into the arm, and then you have this. You probably have some contribution from the wrist, which is a huge debate in biomechanics. Is the wrist, how much is that wrist actively contracting in terms of bringing the racket tip to the ball? Because you're going to see that if you look slowly here, look at this position, and that racket, whether that's from centrifugal forces or some component of active wrist snap. People don't like to use the word snap in biomechanics, but that's like commonly way to describe it on the tennis court, and coaches and players all talk about the snap. But that racket head is coming around here, so the angle is changing here in the wrist, and whether that's from centrifugal force, whether that's due to the physics here, or if there's active contraction here using the stretch shortening cycle, that racket angle is definitely changing from that extreme laid back position. I mean, she couldn't hit the ball like this. If she was at impact, she couldn't hit the ball. So that racket head is coming around. The tip of the racket the angle is decreasing there in relationship to the wrist. So that allows her to level out the strings and hit the ball here, even though she has a bent arm structure. So there's just a number of forces at play here. So people like to talk about, well, the hips are the reason you have power. The shoulders where you get power from, or the wrist is where you get power from, but there's an entire kinetic chain here with many joint actions and joint rotations that's contributing to power. And people need to appreciate all of the different anatomical sources of power on the forehand. And Sloane Stephens is a good example of using all that, but it's in a large package, bent arm structure, huge bubble loop, gigantic loop, which is going to make it hard for her to take the ball early and, on the rise and return a serve, things like that. So that's going to be a small liability, but she can still crank the ball. And, obviously she won a slam. She was a top player, made millions of dollars. So, that's the takeaway there. Could be more optimized, but she's still a great player. All right, here we look at Madison Keys, and I think I'd like to, get your eyes looking at some similar stuff. Try not to get obsessed with the takebacks. Like, look, the women oftentimes have this vertical takeback. This is very common for female players. I'll show you Kasatkina. You saw in the intro, Kasatkina has more of the NextGen style. NextGen style is when the racket's pointing more towards the target in the takeback. I'll identify that for you when we look at Kasatkina or Jennifer Brady, whom I think they both have better examples of ATP optimized forehand mechanics. But here at Madison Keys, also just won a slam. So she's a great player, had a great career, has a huge forehand, but it's not fully optimized forehand in terms of the biomechanics, in terms of the stretch shortening cycle, in terms of the compact nature, how explosive it is in a compact size. Look at the size of her loop here. Racket's very high. Try to compare where the racket is up here versus where her head is. I call this like the two heads relationship. So you have her head here. You have the racket head here. Look how high that is. That's going to take time. It's going to take time to get that racket head through. And with the speed of the game, this is not optimal to be this high. You can get some acceleration from you can get velocity from dropping that mass. That mass is coming down with gravity, so you're going to get some acceleration from a gravity drop perspective. Okay, sorry, here we go. We're back with Madison Keys. Look, similarly to Sloane, she's a little more compact than Sloane, but she's still pretty big. You look where this racket is back here. It's way behind the plane of the body. It's a pretty gigantic loop. Not as big as Sloane. She doesn't have as extreme a Western grip as Sloane. But this is another great example of a WTA style, kind of a classic WTA style. But a very good forehand. It has a nice rhythm to it. It's not as wild as Sloane. Sloane's really looks wild because of her Western grip and like how big a loop she takes behind her body. Here the loop is big, but the grip is semi-Western. Let's look at her lag. Very good lag here. You can see how the wrist is laid back. The wrist gets pushed back. As the hips start to rotate forward, this is like Newton's law. For every action, one of Newton's laws, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So the ground reaction forces are coming up. The energy is getting transferred into the trunk. The hips are rotating. The abdominal muscular starts to rotate. So you're firing the core and the hips, the internal and external. You have external, internal rotation of the hips. You have the trunk musculature rotating externally, rotationally loading and then unloading. And all that power, when you start to unload rotationally there, that's going to cause the racket to lag if you're loose in the arm. The key for the ATP swing or good WTA swing is to maintain a loose arm structure here so you can create a lot of lag. You can put all of the muscle, all the joints of the shoulder and the elbow and the wrist on stretch. You want to create the stretch shortening cycle. The SSC is really critical because then you can access this elastic energy from the tendinous, the musculotendinous unit there. And the tendons and the muscles can have this, they basically snap back with a lot of elastic energy. So that's one of the keys, whether you're hitting WTA style or like in this case, or in Sloane, we saw the incredible lag of Sloane's forehand. You can see the lag here. It's good, and this angle is gonna go from 90 or more, where the racket's laid back, 90 degrees or more. You imagine like Sinner's forehand, where the racket's, he's like Gumby, and the racket's probably more than 90 degrees laid back many times, many of the pros. And then that angle is going to level out. That racket's coming around centrifugally. There's centripetal forces here and centrifugal forces here. And as that racket comes around, that angle here, it's whether depending on how you describe it, it's increasing or it's decreasing. The angle is eventually that racket needs to get leveled out, to straightened out, to face the lag needs to reduce, and there needs to be a reduction in angle there, and so that the racket can face the strings, face the target. We know from the classic work of like Vic Braden and Gideon Ariel that the geometry of the court is important. The old saying, the geometric laws and the laws of physics dictate stroke production. It's the classic Vic Braden saying. And here, this is a good example of that. You have the laws of physics bringing the mass of that tip of the rackets coming around the bend, through rotational physics. That racket head that's laid back is being flung rotationally around the center, and that's contributing to the reduction in the lag angle. And you have the laws of geometry, where we know that those strings need to face relatively straight for the ball to go in. You can't have, the racket can't be, the angle that the racket is here, that can't be maintained in the wrist. I'm sort of focusing in on here. That angle is going to have to shift and decrease. That lag has to decrease for the ball to go straight, relatively straight. I think Vic used to talk about, whether you have like 20 degrees of geometric play angle of play here. So if that racket doesn't square up here, the ball's not going to go, relatively straight. We talk about the size of the backswing. We always talk about the hitting arm structure when we're looking at these types of mechanics. Look at the hitting arm structure here. Very similar to what we saw with Sloane. You can see that the elbow is somewhere in the 80, 90 degrees. And what you'll see with the men, the better mechanics in terms of the physics of the swing, is you'll see that angle will typically be 150 degrees or more. Dr. Brian Gordon talks about 155 degrees or more. So you're trying to get, if we juxtapose like Federer, or like a Rublev or a Rafa Nadal. If we talk about Federer, Rafa Nadal, Rublev, the angle of the arm will be like, the angle of the arm will be something like that. We're looking for 160 or more in terms of straight lever mechanics, and we know that in rotational physics, when the lever's longer, if you can maintain the speed of the object or whatever implement you're using, whether it's a baseball bat or whether it's a tennis racket or anything that you're swinging, we know that if you can use a longer lever, you're going to get more racket speed or more bat speed at the tip of the racket, and you're going to get more angular momentum based on the mathematical calculation than a bent arm. So again, this is not an optimized arm structure in terms of the angle here. We saw 90 degrees Madison Keys forehand, but she is able to make up for that with tremendous power from the size of this loop, building up a lot of momentum here. You can see how this racket's going to come around the bend. A lot of momentum here, a lot of velocity that she's creating, using good kinetic chain work. Good stretch shortening cycle. Good, everything's put on stretch. Remember, shoulder, elbow, wrist. These are the joints at play here. You're going to have that whippiness there. That's critical. If she was locked in those three joints, if she's locked in the shoulder, stiff in the elbow, stiff in the wrist, you're going to see less lag. You're still going to be able to create some power and racket head speed through horizontal shoulder adduction. You may get a little bit of ISR. That's going to be at play. Internal shoulder rotation is going to be at play. You may get a little wrist and movement at the elbow joint, but it's not going to be a huge factor in terms of generating racket speed. So it's just going to be tough to generate spin and speed, max ball speed, especially spin production. Dr. Brian Gordon talks about if you're tight in this lever here, if you're tight in all these joints is a better way to describe it. If the joints are, if the shoulder, if the elbow, if the wrist is tight, then you're really not going to be able to generate as much topspin and pace combined. And Dr. Brian Gordon calls that the heavy ball. And if you have a bent arm here, Brian Gordon says that the topspin is not maximized. So I think that's an interesting aspect too, is that when you have straighter arm mechanics, you get more racket speed. And Dr. Gordon says that ISR is a major contributor to spin in those cases. So rather than using your shoulder just to lift, Keys has a good hybrid here. Watch how she turns this over. She starts to get pretty good. I mean, she's pretty cramped, elbows, where her elbow is. You never see this from a top male player. But she does get good rotation. If you see the way she wipers here, this is really nice. So there's internal shoulder rotation. There may be some forearm pronation. That's the fourth joint that we talk about. There's actually four joints at play here because you have the wrist, you have the forearm, you have the elbow, and you have the shoulder. That's important to note too. You have what the wrist is doing, you have what the elbow is doing, you have what the forearm's doing because the forearm pronates, supinates and pronates. The wrist movement here, elbow here, shoulder. Those four joint components, those are all accelerations that are contributing. Remember, you have hip rotation, you have trunk rotation, you have horizontal shoulder adduction, you have shoulder flexion as you lift the racket, you have shoulder internal rotation, you have all these different rotations. So they have this multifactorial, all these sources of power. So people like to simplify and just talk about the hips or the core, but there's a number of different sources of power at play. And then the interesting thing is what's causing the spin. So for a lot of WTA forehands, they just lift. Or for a lot of classic forehands, they just... Sorry, we lost Madison there. So for a lot of classic forehands, they just lift. So Madison has some pretty good ISR. The ISR is helping with the topspin. I think you can see that. Like this is a particularly good topspin example from her, where the ISR, right, that you can see it clearly post impact. It's happening now, but you can see post impact really good wipering action. That's a really good indicator of that there was a good stretch shortening cycle and contribution from ESR to ISR. So you can see how she came through and wipered here nicely. It's this movement, windshield wiper. The ball's gone, but that gives you a great visual of the ESR to ISR, external shoulder rotation, internal shoulder rotation. There's got to be some pronation there in the forearm. So that would be, you're looking at that. You're looking at what the actual humerus is doing in the glenohumeral joint there, in the shoulder joint. What's happening there? That's where like a lot of that speed's coming from. So this is a great wipering action. Dr. Gordon says if you're not straight, so if you're bent here, that the ISR is not fully partitioned. And what he means by partitioning is that if this lever's straight, if Keys was straighter here, then she could use her internal shoulder rotation, possibly some of that forearm rotation or pronation. It would maximize her ball spin. So she would be able to get more spin without any use of that ISR for ball speed. At least that's Brian Gordon's contention. I don't know if there's a clean partition like that. He says the straighter you are, the more clean that partition is, and I think that's an interesting aspect of the biomechanics. If that's true, I think we need some peer-reviewed research on that to see whether it's actually true. The straighter your arm is, most of the spin's coming from ISR, which is an incredibly fast rotation, rather than just like lifting with the shoulder. Shoulder lift would be shoulder flexion. There's definitely shoulder flexion also on the forehand. When you're bringing the mass of the racket from low to high, that's a shoulder flexion type movement. And if you can imagine you had a stiff, straight arm and you just lifted it up, that would be a very slow way to make topspin. And if you're using lag and you put in the shoulder musculature, the shoulder joint on stretch and using ISR for topspin, that's going to give you a lot more topspin. You're going to be able to hit a much heavier ball by doing that. I think that's very important to try to understand the biomechanics there in terms of how ISR can contribute to topspin, and the relationship between the straighter arm and ISR. If Gordon's correct, then we definitely want to have more of straighter arm mechanics, because that means we can access and use ISR more effectively and efficiently for topspin generation, and let the other sources of power that I mentioned, let those can help with the ball speed, and let ISR dictate the spin rate. If you try to use the other sources of power for power and for spin, it doesn't work so good. You don't get a lot of spin. You get a good flat ball, powerful flat ball, and many women, this is what they do. They hit a good flat ball, but they lose the big heaviness of the ball, and they're not able to get a lot of generation of topspin. So Keys has an excellent WTA-style forehand. It's not fully optimized, in my opinion, but she's a great player with a great career, just like Sloane. So I think those two, that's why I put those two at the start. Like I said, please don't get too wrapped up in the beginning, in what happened in the beginning. Everybody's obsessed with this beginning, whether you're NextGen, you can see she's vertical, whether she's and the arm, there's not a lot of elbow extension. So normally with the men, the elbow will extend into this space right about now. There's elbow extension to try to build that straight lever. And she's just never going to get there. She's going to swing to the inside. The racket's going to go back in that direction behind her body, crossing the mid-plane, which would be the 6 p.m. point. And she's never really going to straighten that lever. That elbow's never going to extend. That is tricep work. She's never going to extend that lever. She's going to keep a fairly bent structure to the lever all the way through the swing. Look at the angle of her arm. It never extends. We'll go through a couple more examples here, and we'll finish with Kasatkina and Jennifer Brady. Now here's Coco, great player. A lot of people debate whether she's got a great forehand or not. I put these three together because I think there's a lot of similarities and a few differences. So Coco has a full Western grip like Sloane, but she's much more compact. So I definitely like her backswing style, her backswing type better. She's more of a type 2. Type 1 is the giant loop of Sloane. Type 2 is what Coco has. Type 2.5. I mean, I guess Madison Keys probably 1.5. Like, she's almost as big as Sloane. But so look what this is interesting because she has the same grip structure as Sloane. Full Western grip, by the way. I don't know if you guys can see that here, but they're both very far over on the grip structure. But she's a lot more compact, so we have a slightly different angle here. But if you look at where her racket is in relationship, like the two heads we were talking about, the racket's a little high here. I know she's been working on her forehand a lot. This is a relatively recent video, so I don't think I think this is a good example. But we have, the racket head here. Maybe that could be a little lower to try to save time in the backswing. But she's way more compact in terms of where that racket is, closer to the 6 p.m. mark than Sloane, for example. So she's more compact here. Let's see if she gets the lever straight. Sorry, lost her there. Okay, we're back. So she's compact here. Let's see what happens with her arm mechanics. She's gotten a pretty straight arm here, so she's got stretched here. So that's good for the stretch shortening cycle. She's putting the shoulder muscles, the elbow muscles, and the forearm muscles and the wrist muscles on stretch. The tendon, most likely good stretch here. But then the lever bends at closer to impact, which I think is suboptimal. Look how cramped she is here. Incredibly cramped structure here. She maintains this cramped swing all the way through. Look at this. So this is kind of what I'm looking at here. Look at the bent arm structure, very suboptimal. As we talked about, you want to get that straighter arm closer to 150, 155 degrees. I mean, she's less than 90 here. She enters in this angle. So as she's accelerating, she's actually shortening her lever to less than 90, which is definitely not optimal. Again, you're dealing with an explosive world-class athlete, and she gets away with it. See if you got one more swing here. Look at this traditional follow-through up high. This traditional follow-through up high around the neck. Definitely, you're not seeing as much ISR there. When you see the windshield wiper action, in terms of the follow-through mechanics, so this would indicate a lot of shoulder lift, a lot of shoulder flexion through the swing. So she's lifting up using shoulder flexion, and then she's horizontally adducting the shoulder across basically the humerus is lifting. She's lifting her arm, her arm bone, and of course the mass of the racket as well. She's lifting up as she's horizontally adducting, but she's not getting a ton of, at least on this swing. I know she can wiper more, but like the swing examples that I have here, maybe she's hitting through the ball a bit more, but look, there's not that much ESR to ISR here, so she's missing out on a huge amount of rotation in terms of stretch shortening cycle and ISR, and that would limit her heavy ability to hit a heavy ball here. and that would affect her spin rate here. If she's trying to spin the ball more, I would expect to see more ISR and white ring action through here, but we don't see that in this example. But so an interesting case, a full Western grip, which is, you can say, is very modern, but a more traditional follow through up around the shoulder, limiting ISR or indicating less ISR, and a more compact backswing structure, and a very bent arm mechanics. And that's interesting forehand of Coco. Here's a forehand that I really like. Top player, Simona Halep, multiple Grand Slam winner. And what I like about Halep, and this again, look at try not to get wrapped up too much in the take back style, the start. Everyone loves to talk about the start, but there's lots of different ways to start world class forehands. This is a classic WTA start. The racket's vertical. There's a really nice flow here. I just love the way she has a nice elasticity, really good mobility in her joints, and a really good fluidity and looseness in the swing. So there's a nice rhythm to the swing, and there's a nice elastic quality of the arm structure. Look how nice her swing flows. There's more rhythm. She's definitely a type 2, so the backswing is large, but it's not huge like Sloane. Let's look at I always like to talk about the relationship of the racket to the head. The racket's way high here. Again, it's not the ultimate compact backswing. Like if you look at center, the racket would be somewhere down here on the take back most of the time, unless it's a high ball. But she's going to generate a lot of buildup. Look how the racket's she's going to get a really good gravity drop, very reminiscent of Keys forehand. She's going to get a good drop here. So the mass of the racket's going to drop with gravity. She's going to get acceleration there. She's going to start firing her hips. She's going to leg drive and fire her hips. Here we go. That's going to initiate and assist with the lag. You have good lag here. You can see how the racket's, she's got a nice relax. You can tell that her wrist is relaxed. Her elbow, shoulder joints are loose. And so she's going to generate really good power here from this lag position. And that, as we talked about with the other forehands, that racket's going to have to come around and square up a little bit. So there's going to be a reduction in the angle of the lag. And that could be passive, could be active. There's a big debate about that. We don't really have all the answers because we don't have a lot of tennis research out there. There's a very thin research in tennis. We've got more research in baseball. Sorry, getting back to Halep here. She's coming around the bend. The hips are firing. The trunk is firing. The core is rotating. She's got, remember, power sources. Shoulder, elbow, forearm, wrist. Shoulder internal rotation. Shoulder horizontal adduction. Centrifugal forces. The racket tip is being flung around a center point. Rotational physics, that's going to be passive source of power. That's probably not going to be, you can make a good argument that that's not active wrist rotation here, or wrist flexion, we might say. But that racket has to get square here. It can't stay at the angle that it was. That angle has to change, or the ball would go way wide. We wouldn't even go in the court. A beautiful position here. She's got a little more extension than the others that we saw. If you see here, look at the angle. She has a kind of a nice hybrid here, where the arm's a little more extended through impact versus Sloane or Madison Keys. Or Coco. Coco is super bent. Really nice. You can see a good example of the ISR here as she's accelerating. Remember, she's going to the pros are going to use a little more ISR when they're trying to whip the ball for topspin, because the ISR is a fast rotation, so you're going to use ISR for topspin. Here's another example. She's returning serve here, so you'd expect to see a little more compact swing type. So you can get a pretty good look here on whether she comes across the plane with the backswing. She does slightly. Right here, even on a return to serve, still not super compact. She's crossing the midline here with her racket lag. You can see that. If you look here, good lag. Rackets crossing 6 p.m. Here we go. Transfer to the energy's transferring to the core and starting to transfer to the upper body. Releasing energy through the arm. This one's maybe a little more cramped. I mean, in general, look how she's got better spacing than Keys or Sloane or Coco. She's got this, it's a prettier forehand, that's for sure. Winning Pretty, my new book. The forehand has a little more looseness and fluidity than some of the others, particularly Coco, who we saw in the last example. Simona's got nice fluidity. Here's another forehand that has a nice fluidity. This is Kasatkina. So here she's just warming up, so she's not doing, kind of max speed. So in these last two examples, we have Kasatkina and Jennifer Brady. There's Brady. Let's just talk just for a few moments about Kasatkina. Sorry, we'll get to Kasatkina. Went back to Coco here. Okay, here's Kasatkina. So I'd just like to point out a few areas to notice. Notice the NextGen style here. Look how the racket's different. The elbow's high. The racket tip points to the target, or points to the incoming ball, and on the beginning here. And then look where the shape of the racket, the backswing is much more ATP. The racket's going to go from the start position down and to the right a bit more, and the entire racket and the pathway of the racket stays on the right side of the body, does not cross the midline. So that's a sign of a compactness where you have less of a swing pathway as you're generating power. There's not as much of a long bubble looping action. Okay, here we go. So look at the path the racket just goes here and down, or here and here, rather than with Sloane especially. We saw the racket go way back there before it started to curve around, and we had Keys there, and we had Halep kind of there, and this is more optimal backswing mechanics because you can generate the same or more power with a smaller backswing, which is key. save time. It's likely that this type of racket face setup, we see where the racket strings are facing away. This is what Sinner does. A lot of Italian players, a lot of top players now, turn the strings to face the back fence. And that's likely creating more of a stretch shortening cycle effect in some of the, I think, the forearm musculature, possibly in the internal shoulder rotators. There's possibly more of a stretch shortening cycle effect in the different joints of the arm that I mentioned, and that's probably why Sinner and many of the pros are turning the hand like that away from the target, which you never used to see in pro forehands. And I used to correct it years ago, and so that's a very typical of the next gen style. So this next gen kind of mean by definition, if there is a definite and a commonly agreed definition, would be the racket tip sort of in this forward-facing position, and then the strings, and there's a rotation. It's basically like a pronation in the forearm during the backswing phase, and then that an extra stretch of the joint structures of the arm, and that probably adds to spin generation or racket speed generation. That's most likely why pros are doing that, even though it seems kind of crazy to turn the strings away from the incoming ball like that. Do you think they'd make a lot of mistakes because they're turning the wrist, the forearm so much? But a lot of pros are doing that now. That's more the next gen style. You see that we'll see in the next clip that Jen Brady does the same thing. So you see Kasatkina here again. Modern, next-gen style. She hit this like a male hitting structure, ATP forehand. Rackets higher than that, so in this example too, it's not as compact as like a Sinner. Head-to-head relationship, racket head above the normal head, the human head. But, really good gravity drop. Look at this gravity drop. And then she's going to fire those hips, fire the trunk musculature. People forget about how much the obliques are playing a role here and other trunk musculature. Very fluid swing. Look at how the arm angle, the elbow joint angle, to be precise. Better than what we saw before. She's maybe not fully straight in these examples, but she does get much straighter in general than the other girls. So let's say maybe something like that. So she's getting more optimized here. It's not fully optimized because it's not straight. She doesn't fully maximize the lever length. Look how loose she is here. Look at the internal shoulder rotation here. Just like to identify that. Look at this. Look how whippy that is. Whoopsh, like a whip here. And you see immediately how much rotation's at play here. We saw that with Keys for an example. We didn't see that as much with Coco. Again, these are selections. So this, a lot of some of the mechanics depends on what they're trying to do with the ball tactically. So just keep that in mind as a caveat when you're looking at any kind of slow motion video. It depends on what the player is trying to do tactically. That determines what the biomechanics are of the swing, what the mechanics look like. So here she's obviously applying a lot of spin, and this movement here is what I'm talking about in terms of maximizing spin. You want to use ISR for spin, right there. The shoulder is rotating fast. That causes the racket to go upward and create brushing. Then you'll see that in the windshield wiper finish like this arcing finish. So Kasatkina's got a great example of an ATP modern forehand. And let's finish with Jen Brady. Unfortunately, Jen Brady, she was a Grand Slam finalist, so she had a world class results. She suffered from some injuries. I believe it was her knee, but she has tremendous talent with a really good example of ATP technique. Look how she starts here. Look at the relationship between the racket head and the human head. Way up. She's way up there. So that's, usually I try to trim that down. She probably trims it down when the ball's coming faster. But again, that gives her a good momentum buildup. But the racket's just going to gravity drop here. Like the whole swing is taking place in this space, which indicates ATP type backswing, type 3 style backswing. She has a NextGen racket face where the racket face is pointing away from the ball. So she's getting extra rotation in her forearm through forearm pronation. And the shoulders most likely being put more on stretch. The internal shoulder rotators are probably getting some extra stretch from this NextGen style setup. It's probably what's happening there. And you probably get some additional assistance, or maybe just a touch more racket speed from the way the forearm or the wrist is rotating through as from this position as you're accelerating. Look at the beautiful fluidity that she has. The lag. We go back here. Just in this first example, look at this tremendous whippiness in her arm. So she's going to come into a bent arm structure. So she's a little straighter here, and then this is also not quite optimal. Look out in this one. She's getting closer to like a 90-degree arm structure, a little bit less than Kasatkina in this example. And so she's not maximizing the lever, but she's got all the other components that are really good. So it's kind of like a hybrid WTA ATP NextGen type deal, where ideally she would have straight arm lever, but she has a bent arm. And it doesn't matter because, just like some of the other girls we saw, some of the other women, she's super explosive. She's got a lot of fast twitch, and she's optimizing many other aspects. So in this case, like this is a great example, like where the backswing is NextGen, the racket work is on the right side of the body, so she doesn't cross the midline, which is key for compactness. She doesn't cross the midline. Okay, we're back. So she doesn't cross the midline, which is key in terms of ATP structure. Sorry, cut. Okay, so we're back. So she doesn't cross the midline, which is very ATP, but then she has a slight bend here, which is just suboptimal in terms of lever mechanics, but she's got tremendous whip and lag. Just imagine her shoulder joint, her elbow joint, her forearm, and her wrist are super, super relaxed and whippy here. Tremendous racket speed here. So she's slightly bent through the impact there, and she's got this great, you can see all the rotation, like the forces that are coming off the ground, and the rotation in her hips and trunk that help to generate the racket speed here. Let's look at another example. We have NextGen, classic NextGen. Racket's pointing forward. It's kind of like an Alcaraz. She's a little high, in terms of the elbow position. Probably wouldn't, kind of like a Kyrgios or a Kokonakis start. The elbow's high. She's got that elbow corked up structure. So that's fine. That's her individual style. Remember, don't get too wrapped up in the takebacks. You remember with Keys and with Halep, the racket was vertical. And here you can see the racket change. The elbow's in a different position on the takeback. And that's fine. That's an individual style. That may contribute. That may help in some aspects, getting the racket accelerating better. But that's debatable, because we know that you can hit a really fast forehand with some of the other styles. If you have a take back with a racket like that, or there's a lot of different ways to take the racket back. That's what I always tell my students. Watch where the racket goes from here. The racket goes it's high. I wouldn't teach this. It's a little higher than I'd like. It's not super compact in that respect. So in terms of the height of the backswing, it's high. You're going to get that's a big loop in terms of height, but it's a small loop in terms of compactness. Racket's very high, just like we saw with Keys, but she doesn't come across the plane, so she's going to save racket pathway distance there. If we look at some of the men who you'll see a similar setup like this, but the racket will be a little lower and it'll be a shorter acceleration pathway, slightly shorter. But this is you could totally see a forehand like this on the men's side on the ATP tour. It's a little big. Plenty of guys that do this. So look where the racket goes. It doesn't go around her body. The racket stays right in here as she comes through. So she's reducing this circumference of the swing in terms of measuring the actual racket distance. She's a little high, but it's not the end of the world. She's got an awesome forehand. She would have to shorten this on fastball, so she's not going to get up here. When the ball comes fast, she'll make an adjustment and trim this up, I'm sure. That's a good option. If you got a player who does a higher take back like this, you can leave it, because that's their style, and you can tell them, look, if the ball comes fast and low, you're going to have to trim this down. And so a lot of pros will do that, and a lot of my top juniors do that. Look at the explosion in the legs here. I want to just point this out. This is really critical. That's a tremendous GRFs, ground reaction forces here. Boom. That's going to create a lot of lag, because she's got this whippy arm. So that explosion from the legs creates the lag. See that here? It's a little different angle, so it's a little different than before. But the racket's lagging back here, and that racket's going to get pulled through. And through rotational physics, that racket is being flung around a center point, around an axis, because of the leg drive, hip rotation, trunk rotation initially. And then there's the rotations in the upper arm, the shoulder, and the lower arm eventually. Boom. This one's similarly, it's not cramped like Iga Swiatek, but it's definitely not straight arm mechanics, even as good as his forehand is. Here's another view, very good view here. Go back here. Check this out. It's a good example of this was the max she had in her backswing. The racket has not crossed the midline. The midline would be somewhat like that. Look how the racket stays on the right side of the body. So in terms of building ATP mechanics for a female player, especially in this case, you'd like that racket work not to cross the midline. So with Sloane, with Keys, with Halep, you would be able to see the racket tip on this side of the body over here. You'd see the racket over here somewhere. Brady never does that. And so Kasatkina never does that. So this is something that you're looking for in terms of a tip-off. Oh, we got more of an ATP structure here. The racket doesn't come across the plane. We talked about how it's high, but it doesn't come across. Great loading in the body. And this is another example. We're trying to get more and more extension here. So she does not maximize the lever arm here. But like I said, she does a lot of other things great. She's got ATP backswing type. She has ATP or NextGen start position and beginning of the take back, as we talked about. Don't get obsessed with that take back part. But I think the real thing you're looking for, and especially in female players, can you get the racket work happening out in this area rather than the racket coming over here like Sloane Stephens. on the take back, on the backswing, sorry. Take back is the start of the racket going back. Then you have the backswing where it is. Then you have the forward swing. Forward swing mechanics, do you have lag? Big time lag. Very loose arm structure. You got all through here, whippiness. Shoulder joint, elbow joint, forearm joint, wrist joint. That kinetic chain, whippy, adding to generating tremendous forces through stretch shortening cycle. Remember, that's like the stretch of the tendons and the muscles, like this elastic effect where the muscles are gonna snap back after being stretched. You're gonna stretch the joints, and then they're gonna snap forward as you're accelerating. And so that's where people get this idea of lag and snap, so some coaches really don't like that term snap, but that's also a debate about biomechanics and technique. Should we call it a snap or not? The reason why coaches don't like snap is that people try to actively snap their wrist and they get injured through like too much wrist movement. That's just the danger when you call it a snap. But there is a snap back in a sense, because that's what the stretch shortening cycle is. It's an eccentric loading. It's a lengthening of the muscles and the tendons, and then it's a very fast shortening, which you could call a snap. That's what the stretch shortening cycle is by definition. Eccentric loading, and then concentric acceleration immediately following the eccentric lengthening and loading of the muscles, and in this case the tendons also contributing to the energy production. So not optimized here. That's something you always check. You'd like to, Brady could do a better job with the spacing here, getting a better. I'm sure she could maximize that lever better, but she's still had a great career. You can see when you see the windshield wiper, when you see how the forearm and the shoulder rotate. That indicates a very good ISR, that wiper movement. See how the forearm wipers over here, the racket's inverted here, racket going down. That's a very, very good sign of internal shoulder rotation. She's got good balls. Definitely got a lot. That'll show you that she got topspin. Here's another angle of the NextGen start, which you start to see a lot on tour now, like Alcaraz, many, many others. This is kind of a NextGen start that a lot of people like. Big high take back, big loop up high, but short loop in terms of coming across the body. So laterally short, vertically high. You can see from here to here, racket from here, as the racket accelerates through to here, a tremendous buildup. As she starts to fire the legs and hips here, you can imagine how fast that racket's going to move to the impact point here. It's going to be unbelievable racket speed if you follow this yellow line. She's like super stretched here, and she's like a rubber band that's going to like explode through. Look at this. Boom. Another example of modern forehand structure is how she comes off the ground using semi-open and open stances. This is something I work on with a lot of players. Look how she comes off the ground here. That's a good sign that you got good ground reaction forces if you're propelling your entire body off the ground. Look at that. Look at how much she rotated at the end. And this is something I'd like to just highlight. I think it's really important. As you look down here, how she's got really good hip abduction. That's abduction at the end. So she made this big rotation, and she lands super wide for stability. Something I work on all the time with my players. So watch how she loads. Look how much she pushes into the ground here. Look how she gets forced down. It's great. And then the force starts to come up here and here. It's classic GRFs there. And the arm is whippy during this moment. So as she's coming up with those ground reaction forces, she's putting force through the energy through the kinetic chain up through the trunk and into the arm, everything's elastic here, whippy and stretchy. So the power now, power's up, power's into the arm now. She's accelerating the mass of the racket. The power's gone from the lower body. Boom. She's off the ground. Big time forces at play. The ball's gone. She transferred all that energy into the ball. And now watch the deceleration phase here. Her hips are going to abduct. Her femur is going out at an angle from her hip joint. And that abduction is key for stability. So that's another important little technical thing you can work on. All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed that deep dive into some of the technique and biomechanics of the WTA forehand and how the WTA forehand is evolving into more ATP forehand, NextGen forehand types like Kasatkina and Jen Brady here, which I think are really good modern examples of how female players can hit ATP type forehands. They can do it. They can hit it just like the men, or very similar to the men. We talked about the important checkpoints. I tried to highlight the way I see the forehand, the way I build the forehand, and the things that you should look for, and also things not to get too obsessed with, for example, like the start or the take back. But the more check boxes you can check in terms of ATP modern forehand for females, the better. All right, guys, see you on the next one.